The echo of the Roman legions passes through the centuries like the distant sound of a silver horn, a testament to the discipline, ambition, and military might that shaped the ancient world. Among these, few have aroused such a dark and mysterious fascination as the Legio IX Hispana, the ninth, which seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving behind only silence and an aura of legend. Britain, land of fogs and stubborn forests, of impetuous rivers and resistant tribes, was the scene of forgotten battles and silent heroisms, but also of failures and disappearances that the pens of Roman chroniclers hesitated to tell. Studying the Ninth Legion means venturing into the most remote borders of the empire, amidst scant archaeological evidence, gaps in written sources and hypotheses that oscillate between history and myth. This dossier does not seek the thrill of the fantastic, but rather follows the traces left by the legionaries, interrogates the documents, compares the scholars, places the ninth in the real historical context of Britain and the Roman West, and recomposes, piece by piece, the puzzle of its destiny. Only in this way, between military discipline, imperial strategies and geographical challenges, can we understand why the Ninth Legion has become a historical cold case, a story that resists time and continues to capture the imagination. The Ninth Legion, known as Hispana, had deep roots in the heart of the empire. Formed in the 1st century BC, probably under Gaius Julius Caesar or shortly thereafter, it participated in campaigns in Hispania, where it gained fame for courage, discipline, and endurance. It was a heavily structured legion, with around 5,000 men under arms, made up of maniples and cohorts, capable of operating both as a battle force and as an instrument of occupation and control. Each legionary was trained to fight, march and build fortifications, camps, bridges, roads, an army capable of shaping the territory as well as dominating it. The ninth, like other legions, was not just a military instrument, but a vector of Romanness, a means by which the empire spread language, law, culture, and infrastructure. Its campaigns in Hispania were harsh and formative, marked by local rebellions and prolonged conflict, and consolidated the legion's reputation as a reliable and disciplined unit. When the ninth was transferred to Britain, the situation changed radically. The province, partly conquered by Claudius in 43 AD, was still far from complete control. The northern tribes, the Brigantes, the Caledonians and other peoples who inhabited the areas beyond the current Hadrian's Wall, resisted ferociously, mastering impervious terrain, dark forests and swamps that made every Roman movement risky. The landscape itself became an invisible enemy, rushing rivers to ford, impenetrable woods that hid ambushes, heights from which local observers could strike without being seen. The ninth was deployed in Eboracum, today's York, a strategic and logistical outpost, collection, rest and supply point. The city was a crucial hub for the mobility of Roman troops, with well-structured camps and workshops for weapons and vehicles. From here, the legion was called upon to ensure control, repress revolts and protect communications between south and north. The experience gained in Hispania was to prove invaluable, but Britain proved to be an entirely different theater, where conventional Roman warfare often clashed with guerrilla tactics and popular resistance. The historical context of the empire in that period makes the fate of the ninth even more intriguing. During the reign of Trajan and later Hadrian, Rome sought to consolidate borders rather than extend them, and the legions in Britain operated as instruments of stabilization rather than conquest. The ninth, having arrived in the north, thus found itself in an area where the Roman occupation was fragile, the presence of troops was limited, and the continuous movements to repress the insurrections exposed the legionaries to considerable risks. Communication with Rome was slow, news filtered through partial chroniclers or local administrators, and what happened in the northern marshes was often not recorded in detail. Subsequent written sources, such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio, mention the legion sporadically, without however providing continuity, leaving large gaps and creating the opportunity for myth. The Roman strategy in the province was twofold: on the one hand, to consolidate the urban centers and communication routes, on the other, to intimidate hostile populations through demonstrations of force. The ninth, like other legions, was trained to build fortifications quickly, establish garrisons in hostile territories and maintain internal discipline even in the absence of reinforcements. The men of the legion were professionals hardened by years of battle and forced marching, capable of adapting to adverse weather conditions, swamps and intense cold. Yet the complexity of British geography, the mobility of the insurgents and the paucity of reliable sources turn any reconstruction into an exercise in documented conjecture. We know where they were deployed, what their main tasks were, but we ignore many details of daily life and specific campaigns in the north. The geopolitical context of the empire at that time also imposed a delicate balance between military and logistical efficiency. The transfer of legions was complex. Each movement required months of preparation, supply and food supplies, and the choice of deployment locations was not random. Northern Britain, on the fringes of the imperial map, was a constant challenge. The local tribes had in-depth knowledge of the territory and the seasons, knew how to attack from a distance and retreat, avoid pitched battles and wear down Roman forces. The Ninth, although prepared and disciplined, therefore faced a war that combined the strength of the legion with the unpredictability of the guerrilla, methodical planning with the instinct of the enemy territory. In this historical context, the Nona Hispana appears as a symbol of Roman power faced with the complexity of the world beyond Hadrian's Wall. He was not invincible, but he represented the order, organization, and adaptability of the empire. Subsequent documentary gaps have transformed these difficulties into an enigma. The absence of certain references to the legion after the middle of the 2nd century AD is what has fueled speculation, myths, and conflicting hypotheses. However, the reconstruction of the historical, military, and geographical context allows us to understand the daily challenges of the legionaries, the reason for their presence in the north, and the dynamics that could have led to an uncertain fate without this necessarily implying a total catastrophe. We know with certainty that the Ninth was an experienced legion, with decades of service behind it, who had faced bloody campaigns and hostile territories. His deployment in northern Britain was not a mistake, but a strategic choice consistent with imperial policies. Every movement, every encampment, every confrontation with the local tribes was part of a broader plan of control and deterrence. The lack of subsequent documentation does not indicate a sudden disappearance, but rather the beginning of a period of silence, of historical gaps that the Roman chronicles did not record, and which today make the Ninth Hispana one of the most fascinating cold cases of ancient history. The presence of the Legio IX Hispana in Britain is not a total mystery, but a mosaic of scattered traces that require careful and patient reconstruction, like an archaeological investigation in the field of memory. The available sources indicate that the legion was transferred to the province around the middle of the 1st century AD, in a period in which Rome consolidated the conquests of the Claudian campaign of 43 AD. The choice of the north, and in particular of Eboracum, now York, responded to precise military and logistical criteria. The site constituted a crossroads between land and river routes, allowed rapid movements towards the rebel territories, and offered a defensive base that could be easily strengthened in case of emergency. Archaeologists have found remains of Roman fortifications in this area, quadrangular structures with ditches and palisades, camps built with care and planning, a tangible sign of the presence of a regular and disciplined force. The excavations also brought to light war instruments, coins, and evidence of daily life, concrete evidence of men who lived, worked, and fought in this remote outpost of the empire. Epigraphic sources constitute another pillar of knowledge. Dedicatory inscriptions, military diplomas, and funerary steles confirm that the Ninth Hispana was indeed stationed in Eboracum and active in the surrounding region. Among these, some inscriptions celebrate victories and dedications to the emperors, testimonies of legates and centurions who had left the mark of their presence. Although incomplete, these sources offer valuable information on the composition of the legion, its personnel, and the length of periods of service. They also reveal the identity of some commanders and centurions, and show how the legionaries were integrated into the administrative and military network of the province, carrying out tasks that ranged from border patrolling to the construction of roads and fortifications, up to the supervision of local communities subject to Roman rule. The daily life of the legionaries was marked by fast pace and rigorous regulations. Discipline, fundamental for maintaining order, included exercises, night guards, and surveillance tasks along the borders. Military campaigns required exhausting marches, crossing swampy forests and difficult terrain, under the gray skies of northern Britain, where the cold and humidity were silent enemies, often more dangerous than the insurgents' weapons. The camps had to be built quickly, with trenches, palisades, and watchtowers. Each legionary was trained for this dual function, soldier and engineer, warrior and builder, in a symbiosis that guaranteed survival and control in a hostile territory. Historians agree that the Ninth Hispana played a leading role in operations in northern Britain. Campaigns against local tribes, although poorly documented, were frequent and often characterized by sudden attacks, ambushes and counter-ambushes. The legion was called to respond promptly, taking advantage of internal discipline and superior training compared to its opponents. However, sources also testify to high mortality due not only to armed clashes, but to disease, adverse weather conditions and shortages of supplies during prolonged campaigns. These factors made the presence of the legion unstable and precarious, and required continuous reinforcement and turnover of personnel. A crucial aspect of the legion's life was the relationship with local communities. Rome did not limit itself to conquering and subjugating, but sought to integrate, through the romanization of urban centers and the construction of civil infrastructures. Roads, bridges, public buildings, workshops and warehouses testified to the imperial presence. Some legionaries could settle temporarily, often by marrying local women, creating nuclei of Roman culture within hostile territories. This phenomenon, documented in other provinces, suggests that the presence of the Ninth Hispana was not only military, but also cultural, and that its impact on northern Britain could have long-lasting, if limited, reverberations. Logistics, vital to the functioning of the legion, were complex. Maintaining such a large force required continuous supplies of food, water, weapons, and building materials. Communications routes were fragile and prone to interruptions, and supplies often arrived with considerable delays. This made the Ninth vulnerable to periods of scarcity, which increased the risk of local revolts, disease, and weakening of internal discipline. Each expedition was a balance of military strength and organizational capacity, and events could quickly spiral out of commander's control, leaving the legion exposed to the risk of casualties or significant casualties. The presence of the Ninth Hispana in northern Britain also coincides with a period of political and strategic changes in the empire. Rome's attention was paid to the consolidation of borders, the management of the provinces and internal stability, rather than expansion. Imperial policy favored the security of urban centers, ports and main communication routes, and the Ninth found itself having to operate in marginal territories, far from the centers of power. This condition contributed to the isolation of the legion, increasing uncertainty about its fate and making it more difficult to document every single episode of its campaigns. The archaeological and documentary analysis also allows us to understand the internal structure of the legion and the functioning of its cohorts. The Ninth Hispana was divided into manipulative cohorts, each with centurions responsible for commanding and training the soldiers. This structure guaranteed operational efficiency and speed in field maneuvers, but also iron discipline, necessary to face a hostile territory and resistant populations. The cohorts, although independent in some operations, operated in synergy, maintaining a common thread between strategy and tactics, between imperial will and needs on the ground. The most evident archaeological evidence, such as camp structures and dedicatory inscriptions, confirm that the Ninth was active at least until the mid-2nd century AD. However, after this period, the sources become scarce and fragmentary, opening the door to hypotheses and speculation. This does not necessarily imply a sudden disappearance, but signals a progressive downsizing, transfers or merger with other units, common phenomena in Roman military practices. The difficulty of documenting these phases contributes to creating the aura of mystery that surrounds the legion, fueling the legend of its disappearance and transforming ordinary events into centuries-old enigmas. The reconstruction of the historical and military context allows us to understand the complexity of the role of the Ninth Hispana in northern Britain. The legion operated in a precarious balance between the imposition of force, control of the territory and management of local communities. The life of the legionaries was marked by rigorous duties, constant risks and the need to adapt quickly to unpredictable situations. The combination of these factors makes the hypothesis plausible that, despite facing significant difficulties, the Ninth did not disappear in an isolated catastrophic event, but experienced a more gradual end, diluted between transfers, absorptions and ordinary dissolutions in the context of the reorganization of the Roman army. The archaeological and documentary presence of the Ninth Hispana confirms, in any case, the importance of the legion as a military and cultural instrument. Its ability to build, fight and administer hostile territories represents an example of the complexity and sophistication of the Roman Empire, where discipline, strategy and adaptation were intertwined with geographical and social difficulties. Every inscription, every ditch dug, every remnant of a camp is tangible evidence of men who lived on the edge of the imperial frontier, facing uncertainty with order and courage, helping to write a page of history that resists despite the gaps in the documents. From this perspective, the IXth Hispana is not just a missing legion, but a window into Roman military life, the challenges of northern Britain, and Rome's ability to manage remote territories. The archaeological and epigraphic documentation allows us to follow his traces, to understand the mechanisms of command and discipline, to evaluate the living conditions of the legionaries and the relationship with the local populations. Despite the lack of certain data on the final fate of the legion, the reconstruction of the historical and operational context allows us to outline realistic and plausible scenarios, avoiding unfounded speculation and keeping alive the memory of a unit that operated at the extreme borders of the empire. The charm of the Legio IX Hispana is largely fueled by the silence of the sources, a void that for centuries has transformed ordinary facts into a mystery shrouded in legend. The Roman chronicles, although attentive to military and provincial events, precisely record only some phases of the legion's life, tracing fundamental stages but leaving out entire periods of its presence in Britain. Tacitus, for example, mentions the legion episodically, but his main interest is often on political events and provincial governors, leaving considerable gaps on the northern countryside. Cassius Dio and other contemporary sources report few concrete details, creating a void that has pushed generations of scholars to question the fate of the ninth. This silence does not necessarily indicate a sudden or catastrophic disappearance, but it signals the selective nature of the Roman historical record, which favors exceptional episodes, major battles and regime changes rather than the routine of the legions on the borders. The documentary void appears particularly evident after the middle of the 2nd century AD. Inscriptions and military diplomas cease to mention the Nona Hispana, and in the official lists of the active legions of the empire it no longer appears. This absence raised immediate questions. Had the legion been annihilated, relocated, merged with another unit, or simply downsized until it disappeared from the records? Modern historians point out that disappearance from records does not automatically imply a violent end. The process of reorganization of the legions, frequent during the central centuries of the empire, could include numerical reductions, administrative rearrangements or movements towards less documented fronts, phenomena which leave few written traces but do not erase the existence of men and units. The geography of northern Britain helps to explain the silence of the sources. Swamps, dense forests and mountainous terrain limited mobility and communication, while local tribes, skilled in guerrilla warfare and sudden attacks, made any military operation uncertain and difficult to document. Roman commanders had to face massive logistical problems, interrupted supplies, widespread diseases, sudden climate changes. Every effort to maintain the discipline and efficiency of the legion in this context was a continuous test of adaptation and resilience. The lack of direct documentation may therefore reflect more the operational complexity of the territory and the fragmentary nature of the Roman chronicle than a military catastrophe. Scholars have noted that the IXth Hispana appears to disappear from the sources in the period following the reorganization of the Roman army in Britain under Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. It is plausible that the legion was transferred, reduced, or incorporated into another unit, common practices in the management of the empire's armed forces. The absence of news may also derive from a simple decline in military relevance. While other legions participated in large imperial campaigns or visible conflicts, the ninth operated in a peripheral region, far from the centers of power and official chronicles. In this sense, the documentary void becomes an integral part of history itself, a reflection of the priorities and limits of Roman historical recording. The silence of the sources has inevitably given rise to hypotheses of all kinds. Some 19th and 20th century historians interpreted the lack of mention as evidence of total defeat in the Scottish mists, a suggestive narrative but one lacking solid documentary basis. Others, however, underline the plausibility of transfers to safer or less documented fronts, suggesting that the legion may have continued to exist, albeit in a reduced capacity, without Roman annalists recording its movements. The archaeological evidence is partial and often difficult to date precisely, but indicates a continuity of Roman activity in the area even after the alleged disappearance of the Nona, suggesting that men of the legion may have continued to operate in the territory, both as an organized unit and as nuclei integrated into other military structures. The lack of explicit references has also favored the proliferation of myths and legends, transforming the documentary void into fertile ground for epic tales. The legend of the legion that disappeared in the mists of Caledonia draws strength precisely from this absence. An efficient and respected legion, which had crossed Hispania and Britannia, seems to dissolve without leaving traces, as if nature itself wanted to erase it. It is this combination of historical silence and collective imagination that makes the Nona Hispana one of the most fascinating cold cases of antiquity, where reality and myth intertwine seamlessly. However, a critical analysis allows us to distinguish what is documented from what is the result of imagination. Modern historians point out that there is no archaeological or epigraphic evidence attesting to the complete destruction of the legion in battle. No massive massacre is confirmed, no official document speaks of annihilation. Instead, sources indicate that legions could be moved, reorganized, or disbanded, often without fanfare, leaving gaps in the official rosters. The silence of the sources thus becomes a component of history, an invitation to investigate methodically, to compare archaeological, epigraphic, and documentary data, to place the legion in a realistic context of military and administrative operations. The implications of this documentary void are profound. The Nona Hispana emerges as a symbol of the fragility of historical memory, of the uncertainty that accompanies any reconstruction of the past. Every archaeological discovery, every new inscription, every critical revision of ancient sources can change our perception of the destiny of the legion, confirming how complex it is to interpret events that are centuries away. The void itself becomes testimony of how the empire managed remote territories, of how the legions were flexible and adaptable instruments, of how written history cannot capture every detail of military and social life. Despite the absence of direct documentation, the IXth Hispana continued to influence the structure of the province. The construction of fortifications, the control of river routes, the management of villages and urban centers, all archaeologically documented activities, indicate a legion still operational, although perhaps reduced or fragmented. The lack of recordings does not imply inactivity, but simply suggests that the news favors spectacular events over the routine of surveillance and control. It is in this void that the legend found fertile ground, transforming the Nona Hispana into a symbol of mystery, but also into an example of resilience and adaptation along the most remote border of the Roman Empire. Silence should not be confused with total disappearance. The absence of concrete data instead allows us to reconstruct realistic scenarios based on military logic, archaeology, and comparison with other legions. The transfers, the merger with other units, the gradual dissolution, the survival of nuclei integrated into the local population are all hypotheses compatible with historical evidence. These reconstructions respect the reality of the facts, avoiding giving in to the narrative attraction of sudden and imaginary catastrophes. The IXth Hispana, through the documentary void, reminds us of the complexity of the empire, the difficulty of following the traces of military units far from the centers of power, the discrepancy between myth and reality. Every ditch, every excavated camp, every found inscription helps to partially fill this silence, allowing us to distinguish between what is probable, what is possible, and what remains legendary. The absence of chronicles is not a condemnation to forgetfulness, but an invitation to interpret history with rigor, to consider the geography, strategy, and daily life of the legionaries, to understand that the mystery of the IXth Hispana arises from the very nature of the ancient world, where not everything was recorded, but every action left traces that we can still discover, analyze, and tell. The hypothesis that the Legio Nona Hispana was annihilated in the mists of Scotland is probably the most evocative and at the same time the most debated among scholars and enthusiasts of ancient history. The legend arises from the absence of concrete documentation after the middle of the 2nd century AD, and from the awareness that the territory north of Hadrian's Wall was hostile, almost impenetrable, a labyrinth of hills, swamps, and forests that constituted a formidable natural barrier. Here the Caledonian tribes, armed with their knowledge of the territory and guerrilla tactics honed over generations, were capable of inflicting heavy losses on any Roman unit that dared to go too far north. The most widespread narrative, fueled by Victorian historians and then by novelists and filmmakers, portrays the Ninth as an entire army overwhelmed by sudden ambushes, reduced to a few survivors, as if fate itself had wanted to erase it from history. Analyzing the military context, it is clear that any operation conducted in Caledonian territory would have entailed high risks. The Roman legions, although disciplined and trained, were not invulnerable. Guerrilla warfare, difficult terrain, the lack of safe supply lines and the intense cold would have made the campaigns particularly difficult. Other Roman contingents are known to have suffered significant losses in this region, but no contemporary ancient sources confirm the complete destruction of the IXth Hispana. The hypothesis of total annihilation therefore derives more from reasoning by exclusion than from concrete evidence. The legion disappears from official records, and historians have deduced that a catastrophic fate could be the cause, although it is equally plausible that it was reduced, transferred or merged with another unit. Archaeological reports provide some indirect information. Remains of Roman camps and fortifications in northern Britain indicate that military operations continued well after the period in which the Nona should have been present. These settlements suggest an organized presence, although not necessarily attributable to the IXth Hispana, and indicate that Rome was able to maintain territorial control even in marginal areas. The lack of direct correspondence between archaeological sites and written sources fuels the myth, giving the impression of a legion mysteriously disappearing, when in reality the absence of detailed records is consistent with the peripheral and difficult-to-document nature of operations in the north. Hypotheses of annihilation often focus on possible large-scale ambushes, with legionaries trapped in swamps or overwhelmed by hostile tribes. Some historians have hypothesized that a coordinated attack by the Caledonians, taking advantage of the fragmentation of the departments and the Romans' poor knowledge of the territory, could have caused losses such as to render the legion ineffective or force a strategic withdrawal. However, modern military analyses suggest that a well-organized legion, even under extreme conditions, would hardly have been completely annihilated without leaving tangible evidence, such as commemorative steles of fallen soldiers or governors' accounts, elements which however do not appear. The theory of total destruction therefore appears more narrative than historically proven. The charm of the legend is amplified by the idea of the Scottish mists, a landscape that almost becomes a character in the story, an element that envelopes, hides, and erases. Poetic descriptions of dark forests and impenetrable swamps helped transform a relatively ordinary historical phenomenon, disappearance from official records, into an epic tale of heroism and tragedy. The narrative emphasizes the courage of the legionaries, the discipline of an army of 5,000 men facing an invisible enemy, and the drama of their possible extinction, creating an aura of mystery that has spanned the centuries. Among contemporary scholars, the Scottish hypothesis is treated with caution. Most historians agree that although the Ninth may have suffered significant losses in the northern campaigns, there is no concrete evidence of total destruction. It is more likely that the legion was reduced in strength, moved to another province, or gradually absorbed into other units, processes common in the management of Roman legions. The epic narrative, although suggestive, is not supported by archaeological data or written sources, and must be considered as a literary construction based on documentary gaps. However, the Scottish hypothesis has contributed to exploring more realistic and plausible scenarios. It is possible that parts of the legion fought intensely in the north, suffering localized losses, and that some surviving legionaries were forced to retreat or integrate into other units. Some men may have remained in local communities, marrying indigenous women and contributing to the partial Romanization of the region, without this emerging in official records. These dynamics explain how the legion can disappear from documents while maintaining material and cultural traces on the territory. The narrative of total destruction was further fueled by popular literary and cinematic culture. Novels, stories and films have transformed the hypothesis into a tragic epic, amplifying the absence of concrete data and giving life to images of a legion lost among forests and mists. These representations have fixed an idea of annihilation in the collective imagination, even without corresponding to historical reality, and have contributed to making the IXth Hispana a symbol of the Roman military mystery. A balanced analysis suggests that the IXth Hispana was not annihilated in an absolute sense, but likely faced intense military challenges, significant casualties, and operational downsizing. The campaigns in the north were risky, and the possibility that entire units met their death cannot be ruled out, but the concept of complete destruction remains unsubstantiated. The legion, although reduced, could continue to operate, be transferred or absorbed, while surviving individuals integrated into the local population, creating a lasting link between Roman culture and indigenous communities. The suggestion of Scotland as the final theatre of the IXth Hispana therefore serves more as a metaphor for the difficulty of controlling remote and hostile territories than as historical evidence. The myth of the mists hides the reality, a legion that faced a complex war which had to adapt to extreme conditions and which, although disappearing from documents, may have left traces of presence through structures, finds and cultural links with local populations. It is in this balance between reality and legend that the history of the IXth Hispana lies, a legion that fought at the edge of the empire and whose memory is preserved in archaeological fragments, inscriptions and stories, rather than in complete chronicles. Comparison with other legions that operated in hostile regions confirms the plausibility of similar scenarios. Reductions in personnel, transfers, mergers with neighboring units and integration of survivors into civilian life were ordinary practices. The IXth Hispana fits into this framework, where the silence of sources is both an indicator of administrative practices and fertile ground for the creation of myths. The Scottish hypothesis, although epically suggestive, does not resist a rigorous analysis of the data, but continues to dominate the imagination because it summarizes the mystery and charm of the northern border of the Roman Empire. The alternative hypotheses to the myth of the Scottish annihilation represent the most concrete and analytical nucleus of historical research on the Legio IX Hispana. Recent studies and critical reviews of archaeological, epigraphic and documentary data have highlighted plausible scenarios that do not require sudden catastrophes, but reflect the complexity of Roman military practices and operational conditions in the empire. One of the most considered possibilities is the transfer of the legion to other provinces, a common practice when a legion was no longer needed in a region or when the empire needed to strengthen more exposed fronts. Some historians suggest that the IXth Hispana may have been moved to the Rhine or along the Danube, where border control was prioritized to prevent Germanic incursions or to strengthen the eastern borders. This move, although not documented by specific inscriptions, would be consistent with the policy of reorganization of the legions adopted by the successors of Trajan and Hadrian, when the stabilization of the provinces was more urgent than expansion. Another hypothesis proposes that the legion was absorbed by another unit, a widespread practice in the Roman army to solve staffing problems or to replace units reduced due to losses. The legions were flexible structures and merging with surviving cohorts of other legions or with auxiliary units could ensure operational continuity without the need for official records. In this context, the disappearance of the ninth from the documents does not imply the physical disappearance of the legionaries, but a change in administrative and military status, which would have allowed the men to continue serving under a different command. Written sources do not systematically record these internal operations, and for this very reason periods of documentary inactivity create the ground for legendary interpretations. Some scholars have put forward the hypothesis that the legion may have been used in the Eastern Wars, towards more distant fronts that were less documented by the main chronicles. The strategic mobility of the Roman legions was high, and the ability to move entire troops to different provinces reflected the empire's flexibility in responding to political or military crises. In the absence of direct archaeological evidence, this hypothesis remains speculative, but consistent with the Roman logistical model. A reduced or relocated legion could continue to operate without leaving significant traces in its place of origin, while its official identity could be incorporated into other formations. The hypothesis of partial destruction represents a mediation between legend and concrete data. The Ninth Hispana may have suffered significant losses in northern Britain, which would have reduced its strength critically, without causing its total annihilation. The survivors could have been withdrawn, integrated into other units or simply transferred to less hostile areas. This theory explains both the absence in subsequent records and the presence of continuous Roman archaeological finds in the north, without resorting to catastrophic scenarios that lack documentary confirmation. Merging with other legions or operational downsizing were usual procedures, and provide a realistic explanation for the documentary void that fuels the myth of the lost legion. The lack of archaeological evidence directly linked to the Ninth Hispana has pushed some scholars to consider the hypothesis of a gradual downsizing. In this scenario, surviving cohorts of the legion would continue to operate as independent units or integrated into new formations, maintaining the traditions and discipline of the Ninth without being officially registered again. This procedure guaranteed the continuity of military experience and the protection of borders, without the legion appearing in imperial documents, a detail that explains the discrepancy between archaeological evidence and written sources. Some theories also suggest that the surviving legionaries may have settled in British territory, forming small communities integrated with the local population. The practice of marrying indigenous women and cultural assimilation was documented in other provinces and represented a way to consolidate the Roman presence without the need for permanent armed forces. These nuclei could have maintained military and construction knowledge, contributing to local Romanization and creating a sort of Roman island in the region, albeit limited and temporary. This hypothesis, although not directly verifiable, is consistent with the historical dynamics of the empire and with the testimony of Roman finds widespread in northern Britain even after the presumed period of disappearance of the legion. The comparison between the different hypotheses highlights how the history of the IXth Hispana is characterized more by fragmentary continuity than by catastrophic ruptures. The lack of certain information allows for different interpretations, but the analysis of archaeological data, military documents and Roman administrative practices points to scenarios of transfers, mergers or reductions, rather than total destruction. Modern historiographical methodology favors plausibility, combining material evidence with logical reasoning about the operational capabilities of the Roman army, rather than relying on unconfirmed epic narratives. Archaeological traces, such as fortifications, camps and isolated finds, confirm that the Roman presence in the region continued even after the period in which the ninth should have disappeared from documents. The distribution of these elements suggests that legions or reduced cohorts were still operating, ensuring the safety of routes and the control of urban centers, without necessarily appearing in the official lists of active legions. This explains the apparent mystery and the discrepancy between myth and historical reality, without resorting to scenarios of total annihilation. The reconstruction of alternative hypotheses also highlights the flexibility of the Roman army. The legions were not immutable entities. They could be reduced, transferred, merged or disbanded according to strategic needs. The IXth Hispana, like other legions, could therefore disappear from the documents while continuing to operate, contributing to the defense of the borders, the construction of infrastructures and the Romanization of local communities. This explains why ancient sources, although silent, do not deny his indirect presence and why the legion can be considered active even without direct records. Ultimately, the alternative hypotheses provide a balanced interpretative key, which avoids narrative excesses and at the same time preserves the charm of the mystery. The IXth Hispana emerges as a flexible unit, subject to the administrative and strategic dynamics of the empire, capable of adapting to complex scenarios without disappearing completely. The legend of the Lost Legion is thus fueled by empty documents and lack of inscriptions, but concrete history speaks of transfers, reductions, mergers and local survivals, elements that offer plausible explanations consistent with the material evidence. This perspective allows us to consider the IXth Hispana not as a victim of a catastrophic fate, but as an example of the complexity and resilience of the Roman army. Its men, discipline, built structures and widespread presence in the territory confirm operational and cultural continuity, even when official documentation is silent. The alternative hypotheses highlight the pragmatic side of the empire, where the management of the legions was dynamic, flexible and adaptable, and where the legend was born from silence rather than from exceptional events. Among the most suggestive hypotheses surrounding the Legio IX Hispana emerges the possibility that, even if the legion was not annihilated or completely transferred, a part of its men may have remained in British territory, gradually integrating with the local populations. This idea is based on known historical dynamics. In several provinces of the empire, surviving or discharged legionaries often chose to settle in the conquered territories, marrying local women and bringing with them military, technical and cultural knowledge that influenced the surrounding communities. Northern Britain, although hostile, presented relatively safe areas, where Roman camps, fortifications and villages could serve as anchoring points for groups of veterans, creating islands of Roman influence within a still largely untamed territory. Isolated archaeological finds, such as coins, construction tools and small objects of daily life, suggest that the Roman presence in some areas survived beyond the period in which the ninth appears in official documents, indicating the possibility of continuity through individuals integrated into local life. This partial survival of the legionaries would have had a significant impact on the spread of Roman culture. Technical knowledge in military, engineering, and administration could be passed on to local communities, contributing to a limited form of Romanization. Some villages may have benefited from defensive structures, water systems, or roads built or maintained by former legionaries, while Roman agricultural, craft, and social practices gradually integrated with indigenous ones. It is plausible that this presence was not visible to Roman chroniclers, focused on spectacular events and large troop movements, but it nevertheless represented a significant historical continuity, a silent testimony to the empire's ability to leave lasting traces even in marginal regions. The concept of a Roman island in northern Britain does not imply the creation of a formal colony or city, but rather the permanence of small groups of men organized according to military discipline, who maintained links with Roman culture and practices. These groups could act as a nucleus of stability, as an example of order and technology, influencing local life without appearing in the official registers of the empire. This scenario reconciles the absence of direct documentation with the continuous archaeological presence, offering a coherent picture of partial survival of the Nona Hispana. Some historians have observed that interactions between surviving legionaries and local populations could have lasting effects on the toponymy, traditions, and even social structure of communities. Roman names of villages, elements of military organization adapted to civilian life, and construction techniques are indirect traces of the presence of men of the legion who had chosen to remain in the area. This not only provides a plausible explanation for the dispersal of the legionaries, but contributes to understanding how the historical memory of the legion could persist through material and social culture, even when written sources were silent. The epic charm of this hypothesis lies in the tension between myth and reality. The IXth Hispana, a legion that had crossed Hispania and Britannia, does not disappear completely, but leaves fragments of itself among the mists and northern hills, elements that survive official history and fuel legends. The image of former legionaries transmitting discipline, ingenuity, and Roman traditions to small local communities recalls the idea of a silent resistance, of an imperial legacy that persists over the centuries despite its absence in the registers, transforming the legend into a possible and suggestive reality. Partial survival also offers an interpretative key to understanding the spread of Roman material culture into northern Britain. Fortified camps, watchtowers, stretches of road and rudimentary water systems present in peripheral areas indicate not only military operations, but also prolonged and continuous interventions, compatible with the presence of small groups of legionaries. Coexistence with local populations would have required adaptation, negotiation, and cultural exchange, elements which strengthen the plausibility of the permanence of former soldiers in the territory and the possibility that some have left descendants and material traces. This hypothesis also suggests a more nuanced view of the legion's fate. The IXth Hispana would not be annihilated or completely relocated, but gradually absorbed into the social fabric of northern Britain, while the surviving cohorts continued to operate in other provinces or were incorporated into new units. The combination of operational reduction, transfers, and local survival explains the absence in official documents and the persistent fascination of mystery, showing how the history of the legion can be understood through material evidence, military logic, and analysis of cultural dynamics, without resorting to unsupported legendary catastrophes. Some scholars have hypothesized that these communities of survivors may have acted as repositories of military knowledge, training, or influencing local populations and contributing to a sort of strategic and cultural continuity. Roman discipline, organizational capacity, and construction techniques could persist in a reduced form, creating a bridge between official Romanism and the daily life of local tribes. This scenario, while fascinating, is consistent with historical practices documented elsewhere, where surviving legionaries left a lasting imprint on conquered communities, without appearing in official records. The narrative suggestion of the survival of groups of legionaries is thus intertwined with historical reality. It offers a plausible explanation for the persistence of Roman finds in northern Britain and the silence of written sources, providing an interpretative key that combines myth, archaeology, and military analysis. The surviving legionaries, integrated into local life, represent a tangible continuity of the Roman presence, an invisible thread that connects imperial power to the most remote territories, and that transforms the legend of the Nona Hispana into a story of adaptation and resilience. The charm of this hypothesis also lies in its ability to combine drama and realism. The legion does not disappear as in a tragic epic, but leaves living traces, cultural legacies, and material testimonies that resist official history. The men who remained helped to build bridges between different worlds, to spread knowledge, and to keep alive the memory of Roman discipline and organization, even when their names ceased to appear in official lists. In this sense, the Ninth Hispana has never completely disappeared. Its presence survives in the landscapes, settlements and communities that were touched by its men. This perspective allows us to read the history of the Nona Hispana not as a definitive tragedy, but as a complex and stratified phenomenon. The legion operated in difficult territory, suffered losses, was downsized or relocated, and some of its men found a new role in local society. The combination of these dynamics explains the documentary void, the historical gaps and the fascination of mystery, while offering a reading consistent with the archaeological evidence and the known practices of the Roman army. The charm of the Legio IX Hispana has spanned the centuries not only through historical sources and archaeological finds, but also thanks to the collective imagination fueled by novels and films, including the well-known The Last Legion. The cinematic narrative offers an epic version of the Legion, transforming it into a symbol of heroism and tragedy, and placing it in a temporal context different from the real one, mixing myth with history with a spectacular and engaging effect. The film, set at the fall of the Western Roman Empire, temporally shifts the story by centuries with respect to the historical sources of the Ninth Hispana, creating an epic tale that responds to narrative needs rather than documentary truth. The choice to place the Legion in that period allows us to build a dramatic plot, with fictionalized characters and events, but inevitably introduces distortions with respect to the real context of Britain in the 2nd century AD, where the Ninth was active. The temporal difference between the historical Legion and its fictionalized version highlights the discrepancy between myth and history. The Ninth Hispana operated in northern Britain, facing local challenges, tribal guerrillas and the management of conquered territories, while in the film it is depicted as a unit that survived the fall of the empire, engaged in extraordinary events far from the British context. This gap allows us to understand how cinematic myth is built on epic suggestion and the desire to complete historical gaps with narrative imagination, but cannot be confused with documentary evidence. However, the film indirectly reflects some realities of the Roman Legion. The discipline, the cohesion of the departments, the ability to adapt to extreme conditions and the cultural impact of the legionaries on local communities. The historical sources, although fragmentary, show a very different picture. The Ninth Hispana was engaged in garrison and control operations, construction of fortifications, patrols along hostile borders and management of urban centers, activities that required organization, resilience and cooperation with the local population. There were no epic campaigns outside the province, no rescue missions or spectacular adventures, but a complex and dangerous routine, where the silence of the news and documentary gaps fueled the myth. The temporal and narrative distance between reality and cinema allows us to appreciate the use of the epic tale as a tool of fascination without superimposing it on historical data. The gap between myth and reality is also highlighted in the representation of the Legion's survival. In the film, the Ninth Hispana resists as a cohesive entity, while the story suggests more complex scenarios: reduction of personnel, transfers, integration of survivors into the local population, or merger with other units. These events, although less spectacular, respond to the real military and administrative dynamics of the Roman Empire, where the legions were flexible and adaptable instruments, capable of modifying composition and function in response to strategic and operational needs. The permanence of groups of legionaries in the area, without appearing in the official registers, offers a plausible interpretation of the survival of the Ninth, albeit far from the dramatic cinematic events. The film narrative also emphasizes the concept of identity and honor of the Legion, elements that reflect Roman discipline and internal cohesion, but which in historical reality were expressed in more pragmatic ways: rigorous training, respect for hierarchies, ability to operate in marginal and hostile territories, integration with auxiliaries and local communities. These characteristics were essential for survival and efficiency, and constitute the aspects of the Legion that myth transforms into spectacular heroism. The main difference is therefore between operational reality and narrative representation. Both share the centrality of cohesion and discipline, but the second amplifies the epic element to the detriment of historical precision. The film and other literary works have contributed to fixing in the collective imagination the legend of the Legion that disappeared in the mists of Scotland, symbolically connecting the myth to the visual suggestion of rugged landscapes, dramatic battles and tragic losses. This representation reinforces the idea of the Nona Hispana as an unsolved mystery, but does not correspond to historical reality, which speaks of daily military operations, movement of units, reductions and local survivals. Cinema provides an emotionally powerful narrative, but it must be contextualized to distinguish between narrative and historical data. The temporal gap between film and reality also allows us to reflect on the ways in which historical memory is constructed and transformed. The Ninth Hispana, which disappeared from official records after the middle of the 2nd century, becomes the protagonist of subsequent narratives that fill documentary gaps with epic inventions. The historical reality is more fragmented and complex. Operational reductions, transfers and integration of survivors explain the silence of the sources and the persistence of Roman finds in the region. The cinematic legend, although distorting from a chronological point of view, restores the idea of the resistance, cohesion and lasting charm of the legion, making the myth a reflection of Roman values and imagination. Some historians and archaeologists have pointed out that epic narrative can have interpretive value when compared critically with factual data. Military structures, camps, everyday finds and inscriptions indicate that the presence of the Nona Hispana, although documented in a fragmentary way, had a real impact on the province. Film fiction, amplifying the heroism and tragic fate of the legion, maintains attention on the theme and stimulates interest in historical reality, while requiring caution in its use as a source of knowledge. The comparison between film and history allows us to understand the key points of the story of the Nona Hispana. The legion operated in a difficult context, suffered losses, could be transferred or reduced, and some survivors could integrate into local life. The cinematic narrative exaggerates these elements to build an epic tale, but the historical truth lies in the operational logic, in the material evidence and in the real dynamics of the Roman Empire. The myth does not deny history, but transforms it into tale, emphasizing the heroic qualities of the legionaries and the challenges of Britain's northern border. In this sense, the critical analysis of the cinematic myth highlights the gap between historical reality and narrative representation, showing how the Ninth Hispana can be interpreted in different ways depending on the sources. The legend remains powerful because it summarizes the mystery, courage, and cultural impact of the legion, but historical investigation allows us to distinguish between fictional hypotheses and concrete evidence. The legion, although disappeared from records, left material and cultural traces that tell a story of resilience, adaptation, and influence in the northern territory of Britain. This approach allows us to keep the memory of the legion alive without giving in to spectacular fantasies. The Ninth Hispana emerges as an example of discipline, flexibility, and integration, whose legacy survives not only in inscriptions and artifacts, but also in material culture and historical memory. The cinematic myth enriches the legend, but the historical reality, based on archaeological evidence and documentary analysis, allows us to rigorously understand the fate and real impact of the legion, placing the Ninth Hispana within a coherent framework of operations, survival, and cultural influence. In tracing the fate of the Legio IX Hispana, every fragment of evidence, every hypothesis advanced by historians and every legendary suggestion must be lined up like pieces of a mosaic that slowly reveals a complex but coherent figure. The first element to consider is the historical documentation. The legion appears in the sources until the middle of the 2nd century AD, mainly engaged in central and northern Britain. The inscriptions, military diplomas and indirect testimonies indicate that it was present in the main camps and fortifications of the province, carrying out garrison, construction, and patrolling tasks. Disappearance from official records after this period does not automatically imply annihilation. Instead, it reflects the selective nature of the Roman chronicle, which does not systematically record transfers, organic reductions, or fusions of units. Analyzing the most discussed hypotheses, a clear distinction emerges between myth and reality. The legend of the annihilation in the mists of Scotland, although fascinating, has no archaeological or documentary evidence. Battles with Caledonian tribes may have resulted in casualties, but there is no indication that the legion was totally destroyed. This hypothesis therefore remains a narrative construction born from the absence of information and fueled by the romantic charm of the military tragedy, which transforms the disappearance from the registers into an epic catastrophe, albeit far from the historical truth. Alternative hypotheses, based on transfers and reorganizations, offer more plausible explanations supported by concrete data. It is likely that the Nona Hispana was reduced in strength, moved to other provinces, or absorbed into nearby units. The Roman army, extremely flexible, operated with rules of adaptation that allowed it to preserve efficiency and discipline without necessarily recording every movement or merger. In this context, the disappearance from official records becomes understandable, as does the persistence of archaeological finds in northern Britain, which testify to continued activity even after the period in which the legion appears in the documents. A crucial aspect concerns the possible partial survival of the legionaries. Some men, survivors of difficult campaigns or seconded to local tasks, may have integrated into British communities, creating small islands of Roman culture and discipline. The practice of marrying local women, maintaining technical knowledge and passing on military experience was known in other provinces, and offers a coherent explanation for the persistence of Roman traces, the construction of fortifications and the diffusion of cultural elements in the region. These nuclei represent an indirect continuity of the legion, which survives in the social fabric without appearing in the official registers. Comparison with other legions documented in similar scenarios reinforces this interpretation. Staff reductions, transfers to less documented fronts, mergers with neighboring units and integration of survivors into civilian life were common practices in the empire. The Nona Hispana therefore falls into a coherent model, not disappeared due to catastrophe, but dispersed and reabsorbed through consolidated military and social dynamics. The cinematic legend, as in The Last Legion, transforms these events into an epic and dramatic tale, but cannot replace the rigorous analysis of the sources. Material evidence, from campsites to everyday finds, testifies to the continuing presence of Roman influences in northern Britain. These elements confirm that the legion, even if not registered, left a concrete trace in the life of the province. The fortifications, communication routes, water structures and small settlements indicate a structured and persistent activity, compatible with the presence of surviving nuclei and transferred units. The IX Hispana thus becomes a symbol of resilience and adaptation. Its legacy survives in the territories it presided over, even when the official name disappears from the registers. The overall narrative therefore suggests a realistic and nuanced picture. The legion was not annihilated in Scotland, nor completely dissolved in a military cataclysm. It probably suffered significant losses, operational reductions, relocations and partial integration of survivors into the local population. These dynamics explain both the silence of the sources and the persistence of material traces, providing a coherent and documentable historical reading, which combines military strategy, Roman administration, and cultural processes in the territory. The analysis of the sources and archaeological evidence therefore leads us to consider the most probable solution. The IX Hispana ceased to exist as a documented independent legion, but its men and its influence continued to operate under different forms. The legend of the Lost Legion, although suggestive, arises from the intersection between documentary silence and narrative imagination. The historical reality, based on concrete data, suggests a complex but coherent destiny, made up of downsizing, transfers and local survivals, which guarantee continuity and Roman presence in northern Britain. In this context, myth and history meet. The charm of the Nona Hispana derives from the mystery and silence of the sources, from the epic suggestion of literary and cinematographic stories, but finds solid roots in the operational reality of the Roman Empire. The legion becomes a symbol of discipline, resilience and adaptation, whose legacy lives on in the landscapes, archaeological finds and communities that were touched by its presence. The IX Hispana, although disappeared from official documents, leaves a lasting mark, an invisible thread that connects its history to the social and cultural fabric of northern Britain, demonstrating that legend and historical truth can coexist, intertwining in a tale of mystery, strategy, and continuity. The final conclusion that emerges from the integrated analysis is clear. The IX Hispana does not disappear due to catastrophe, but goes through a process of transformation and controlled dispersion, leaving traces of itself through survivors, transfers, and cultural influence. Documented history and archaeological evidence confirm the plausibility of this solution, while legend and myth contribute to keeping interest alive, giving life to an epic tale that does not contradict historical truth, but completes it with charm and suggestion. The Nona Hispana thus remains a cold case of antiquity, whose charm does not derive from unsolvable mysteries, but from the balance between concrete data, plausible hypotheses and epic narratives, offering a story that combines historical rigor and epic imagination, coherent, fascinating, and lasting.